Thanks very much for staying with us. Time now for Eye on Africa with me, Georgia Calvin-Smith. Tonight, rescue efforts in Libya are hampered by impassable flooded roads and difficult coordination between the country's two rival governments. And yet the international offers of support continue to mount in the wake of devastating flooding in the east that's cost thousands of lives. Also, 6 of the top 10 countries in the world with the highest suicide rates are in Africa. Awareness and political will to tackle the problem across the continent is growing, but the response has to be multifaceted and compassionate. I speak to a top psychiatrist about what support he envisions for his continent. And tensions flare once again between Ethiopia and Egypt after Addis Ababa's filling of its controversial Grand Renaissance Dam. Its construction on the Nile, whose waters the countries share with Sudan, has long been a source of a dispute. But first, there are concerns that political strife in Libya, combined with blocked roads and logistical hold-ups, could get in the way of getting help to the east of the country in the wake of one of the most deadly environmental disaster that it's ever suffered. At least 2,300 people have been killed and around 10,000 missing in the wake of flooding that wiped out huge parts of the city of Derna after after 2 dams burst on Sunday night. Rescue operations have struggled to make it to where they're needed most.
It's a catastrophe which began on Sunday with this storm Daniel, which ripped through quite a few cities in the east of Libya. The worst impacted is Derna after 2 dams there gave way and flooded the entire city. So Derna is a city that's submerged. The scale of destruction is extremely huge. The number of dead is past 2,000. Today we have between 3,000 and 4,000 people that are missing, and we don't know what situation they are in. The city has been completely destroyed. Schools, hospitals, and the entire infrastructure has been destroyed. So we are in a city that's completely collapsed.
The Libyan consul there in Paris speaking to us a little earlier on. Now, at least 2,901 people are known to have died in an extreme quake that hit the High Atlas in Morocco on Friday. The number of injured has topped 5,500, and some villagers in the more remote mountain communities around the epicenter of that disaster have been growing increasingly frustrated at their long wait for help as they try to search for survivors. Rescue efforts have been spearheaded by the military. The kingdom has also only accepted international offers of help from Spain, Qatar, the UAE and the UK for now. Meanwhile, the UN's human rights chief has accused the RSF paramilitary that's on one side of Sudan's deepening civil war of killing hundreds of people in ethnically motivated attacks in Western Darfur. Now, bloodshed has been escalating in the country since fighting first broke out between the RSF and the army in April. Over the last few days, Khartoum has suffered particularly intense bombing. Our regional correspondent tells us more.
It's the deadliest attack in Sudan's nearly 5 months of conflict. We know that the airstrike took place in the early hours of Sunday morning and was conducted by the Sudanese army, killing around 50 people. We also know that more than 70 people were injured, with many of them requiring amputations. So the airstrikes were carried out over the southern Khartoum's May neighbourhood. The Rapid Support Forces have long been accused of using these residential areas as human shields, while the army has been accused of repeatedly bombing these civilian neighbourhoods in which the Rapid Support Forces have been embedding themselves. So while the Rapid Support Forces control many of the city's streets, the army controls the skies over Khartoum, and civilians are all too often caught in the middle. Now, the airstrikes over the market were not the only attacks that took place on Sunday. There were also airstrikes in other parts of southern Khartoum, where the Rapid Support Forces have been trying to capture a military base. The attacks on Sunday come just a week after another airstrike in southern Khartoum killed 20 civilians. Now, the clashes have also spread beyond the capital, including to the western Darfur region, which has seen an outbreak of ethnic violence. Now, estimates show that around 5,000 people have been killed since fighting began in April, but the real number is likely to be a lot higher.
Opposition parties in Madagascar have accused the president of manipulating events to mount an institutional coup ahead of November's election. Now, Andre Radziwill has resigned to run for re-election, but his ministers will still be running the country following an unprecedented court decision. Gael Borja talks us through.
Madagascar has never faced a political mess quite like this one. Current President Andre Radziwill is going to be running for re-election in November. And to do so, the constitution requires him to quit and hand over interim power to the President of Senate, which is the upper chamber of parliament here. So President Radziwill resigned last Saturday as expected, but then things got complicated. That same day, the Senate president surprised everyone by refusing to take over running the country for personal reasons. So the High Constitutional Court instructed the current government, the one appointed by Andre Radziwill, to take up the reins. This is not standard legal procedure. And the last-minute withdrawal of the Senate president has led to accusations from Radziwill's opponents that he manufactured the situation so that he could keep running things through his ministers even after he's officially stood down.
The Senate president doesn't have cancer. As far as I know, he is in good shape. He must have resigned under pressure. Once again, this is a trick to make sure the electoral process is on their side.
President Radziwill made things even more suspicious when he called himself a master of political strategy as he congratulated the Senate president for his decision.
You know I'm a strategist. I know how to develop political strategies.
Is this resignation a political strategy? We tried to reach the Senate president, but he did not take our calls.
Gael Borja there for us in Madagascar. Now, World Suicide Prevention Day was marked at the start of the week. It's a crucially important issue for Africa, as the continent sadly has the highest average suicide rate globally. 6 of the 10 countries in the world with the highest rates are on the continent, with Lesotho right there at the top. There is a push for more infrastructure, openness, awareness and tools to prevent suicidal deaths in Africa. I'm joined now for a closer look at the issues by Professor Taiwo Latif Sheikh, the Africa coordinator for the Lifeline charity. Professor, thanks so much for speaking to me. First of all, so as I mentioned there, Lesotho is right at the top of the global list for the highest suicide rates, and the rate across the continent is also higher than anywhere else. Why is that the case? What can you tell us about this?
Thank you very much. You've said what is very correct. The suicide rates across Africa is the highest among all the other continents in the world. However, it is very important that we understand that the factors involved are so many, but I'll mention quite a number because of time. What is common among the low-income countries where suicide is very high is the commonality of the what we call social determinants of suicide. You find this across all the low-income countries, but it's highest in the African continent. And this social determinants includes things like poverty, especially lack of purchasing power, unemployment, civil strife and terrorism, human rights abuses, and so on. These are social determinants that you find very high on the African continent. We also know that over 90% of cases of suicide are related to mental health conditions. And in Africa, access to quality and effective mental health intervention is very, very limited because of very obvious reasons, lack of availability of mental health services, and barriers to uptake of such mental health services in Africa is also very poor. So where you have mental health conditions as an indicator for suicide, and you have lack of availability of access, barriers to uptake, you will also likely to have very high level of suicide in Africa. And then I also need to mention that Africa is a youthful continent, and suicide among the youths, especially between the ages of 15 and 29, is highest in Africa compared to other continents in the world. And because Africa is a youthful continent, and you have very high suicide rate among youths, then it's likely going to be very high on the African continent. So there are other issues that are related to this high number of percentage of suicide on the continent, which also include the issue of criminalization of suicide. Where suicide is criminalized, people don't come forward to uptake services available. People don't discuss it openly, and this can also lead to increased number of suicide on the continent.
Now, when it comes to the issue of criminalization of suicide, you were mentioning to me earlier that you're particularly concerned about how that poses an impediment to the continent's ability to bring down those suicide rates. And you were saying that it also gets in the way of a more compassionate approach that you believe is more culturally consistent with the region. Can you tell us a bit more about that, please?
Yes, criminalization of suicide is foreign to Africa. It's a legacy left behind by the colonial governments, especially English-speaking African countries. They all have this criminalization of suicide in their Criminal Code Act. And culturally in Africa, Africans abhor suicide. Religions in Africa abhor suicide. Traditions in Africa abhor suicides. But when it comes to people who try to take their lives by suicide, African culture is more compassionate. They support them. They try to help them to survive and not to allow them to, die by suicide. So it is a strange law that is very, very non-compassionate, that is very cruel among Africans. The colonial rulers who left us with this law have gone ahead to change their own laws and decriminalize suicide in their country. It is very important that we also align with the culture of Africa, compassionate way the Africans treat people who try to harm themselves, and expunge these laws from our Criminal Code Act.
So what other kind of support systems and tools do you want to see be made more available across Africa in order to tackle the high rates of suicide the continent's seen?
We need to have a coherent kind of governance system for suicide prevention strategies in Africa. So countries are encouraged to adapt the Africa CDC strategic plan for mental health for Africa, which was launched in 2022. This plan is signed by heads of government of Africa to be able to have a good direction and coherent strategic plan framework for suicide prevention across the country. It is also very important that we adapt crisis lines, crisis helplines that are toll-free, that people can increase access to people to get intervention for suicide prevention. These crisis helplines do not only provide intervention, but they also provide avenue to generate data for development of health system towards prevention of suicide on the continent. If we have crisis helpline, you can call it from your room, you can call the line from the market, you can call the line from anywhere, and that will further help us to generate data for health planning, planning for infrastructures for intervention, planning for budgets, planning for capacity building. These are the things that we require to be able to abate this high rate of suicide on the continent.
Professor Taiwo Lateef Sheikh, thank you so much for giving us a bit of an insight into that problem on the continent and some of the options that are being pursued to try and tackle it. Thank you very much, Professor. Well, finally, tensions have flared once again between Ethiopia and Egypt after Addis Ababa's announcement that it's filled its Grand Renaissance Dam. Its construction on the Nile, whose waters the countries share with Sudan, has been the source of a long-running dispute. Clarisse Fortuné has more.
Images of the Nile and the Great Renaissance Dam posted on the Ethiopian Prime Minister's social network. Abiy Ahmed made the announcement. Filling of this mega dam, said to be Africa's largest, has been completed. An operation denounced by Egypt that depends on the Nile for 90% of its water needs. It said Ethiopia's unilateral measures do not take into account the interests and rights of the two downstream states, nor their water security protected by international law. The megadam cost around €3.5 billion. It's expected to generate over 5,000 megawatts, to double Ethiopia's electricity production, to which only half the country's population of 120 million currently has access. Before Egypt and Sudan, downstream countries of the Nile have seen the dam as a threat to their water supplies. Further negotiations are still scheduled to take place in a bid to reach an agreement on operating the dam.
Well, that's it for Eye on Africa for now. Thanks so much for joining us. Do so again. Till then, take care.